My wife took the house, the savings account, and our 2 kids, and then had the nerve to look me in the eye at the closing of our divorce proceedings and say, "You gave us 20 years of nothing that mattered." I was 43 years old. I had spent those 20 years building a civil engineering firm from 3 employees and a leased office on the edge of Knoxville to a regional operation with 42 staff and contracts across 4 states. I had given up sleep, weekends, anniversaries, school plays, and more than a few pieces of my own sanity to build something real. And the woman I had built it alongside, the woman I had co-signed student loans for, moved across the country for, held through 2 miscarriages and a father's slow death, told a family court judge in Knox County, Tennessee, that I had been emotionally unavailable and financially controlling for the duration of our marriage. Her attorney was very good. Mine was adequate. The difference cost me everything. I want to be clear about something before I go further, because I know what some people will assume. I did not cheat. I did not hit her. I was not absent in the way the word absent usually means. What I was, if I'm being honest, and that's the whole point of telling this story, was someone who believed that working harder was the same as loving better, that providing was its own form of presence. My wife, Renata, disagreed. She disagreed for years in small ways I didn't notice, and then she disagreed all at once in a way I couldn't miss. She filed in October. By the following spring, I was living in a 2-bedroom apartment in West Knoxville with a folding table, a couch from the Salvation Army, and a custody arrangement that gave me my kids, my son Kieran, who was 15, and my daughter Abby, who was 12, every other weekend and Wednesday evenings. That was it. That was what 20 years had been reduced to. Renata got the house in Bearden, the joint savings, roughly $280,000, and primary custody. The firm itself survived the divorce technically intact, but the legal fees, the settlement, and what I can only describe as the psychological damage of watching everything I built get sorted through like items at an estate sale left me unable to function the way I had before. I lost 2 major contracts in the first year because I couldn't focus. 2 of my senior engineers left because they sensed the instability. By the time I was 45, the firm that had been the proof of everything I'd worked for had shrunk back down to 9 employees and a borrowed line of credit. I told myself I was rebuilding. I said it so many times it almost became true. The divorce hit my kids differently. Kieran was old enough to be angry, young enough to direct it at me, and stubborn enough to hold on to it for years. He sided with his mother in the way teenagers side with the parent they live with. Not out of certainty, but out of proximity. He stopped returning my calls consistently somewhere around his 16th birthday, and by 17 was giving me the kind of monosyllabic responses that made our Wednesday evenings feel like visiting hours at a facility. Abby was different. She was sad rather than angry. She would curl up against me on the couch during my weekends and watch whatever I put on without complaint. And when I drove her back to Renata's on Sunday evenings, she would hold on a few seconds longer than necessary before letting go of the hug. She never said she was caught in the middle, but she was. She was obviously and achingly in the middle, and there was nothing I could do about it that felt like enough. I stopped sleeping well somewhere in my 46th year. Not dramatically. I wasn't lying awake catastrophizing. I was just waking at 3 or 4 in the morning with a kind of flatness that I couldn't shake. I would make coffee and sit at the folding table, that was now a real table but still felt temporary, and I would think about what I was going to do with the rest of my life. I never came up with an answer that satisfied me. I would go back to work. I would eat lunch at my desk. I would pick up Abby on Wednesday evenings and take her to Chick-fil-A because it was the one thing I knew she still reliably wanted. In the summer of my 47th year, I started having chest pain. I ignored it the way men my age ignore things that scare them. It wasn't severe. It came and went. I told myself it was stress, which was probably half true. But in September of that year, during a site walk in Chattanooga for a bridge rehabilitation project, I felt something shift in my chest that I could not explain away. It wasn't pain exactly. It was more like a pressure that had decided to make itself known. I sat down on a concrete barrier on the side of the road, and my site supervisor, a 28-year-old named Cole Hutchins, looked at me with a face that told me I looked as bad as I felt. He drove me to the ER himself. He wouldn't take no for an answer. The cardiologist at Erlanger Medical Center was a woman named Dr. Ingrid Vasquez, 51, who wore her hair pulled back tight and had the manner of someone who had said hard things to people so many times that the difficulty had been replaced by a kind of steady directness. She sat down with me the evening after my second round of testing and told me that my heart was showing signs of a hereditary arrhythmia. a pattern in the electrical signaling of the cardiac muscle that was structurally atypical and consistent with a condition called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. The reason I'm flagging this as hereditary rather than lifestyle-related, she said, is that the pattern we're seeing is very specific. It's not the kind of thing that develops from stress or diet alone. This is something that runs in families. I need to ask you about your parents. I told her what I knew. My mother, Joanne, had died of ovarian cancer at 58. My father, my listed father, Dale Whitmore, had passed from a stroke 4 years earlier. Neither had ever been diagnosed with anything cardiac. Dr. Vasquez looked at my chart, then back at me. Is there any possibility of a genetic history you're not aware of on either side? Any adoption or, my mother told me once, I said, and then I stopped. I had to think about when she had told me. It was right after my college graduation, over dinner at a Mexican restaurant in Maryville, where she had drunk 2 margaritas and become briefly unusually honest. She had told me that Dale was not my biological father, that my biological father was a man she had known briefly before she met Dale, that she had told Dale before they married, and that Dale had chosen to raise me as his own. She had given me a name. I had not written it down. I had been 22 and the information had landed somewhere between shocking and abstract, and I had responded by ordering a 3rd basket of chips and changing the subject. I told Dr. Vasquez all of this. She nodded slowly. If there's any way to get more information about your biological father's cardiac history, that would be genuinely useful. Not just for your case, but for your children, Kieran and Abby. The thought hadn't occurred to me until she said it. I called my mother's younger sister, my Aunt Cecile, that same evening from my hospital room. Cecile was 63 and lived in Asheville and was the keeper of every family story my mother had taken to her grave. I asked her if she remembered anything about my mother mentioning a man before Dale. There was a pause on the line. She mentioned him twice that I recall, Cecile said. His name was Harold Sutton. He was from somewhere in South Carolina, Charleston, I think. They were together maybe 8 months. He was older than her. I think he was already 30 when she knew him, and she was 24. Do you know if he's still alive? Another pause. I don't know. I honestly don't know, honey. I hired a genealogical research service the following week from my hospital bed because Dr. Vasquez had recommended I stay for observation and I had nothing else to do. The service called me back in 4 days with a file. Harold Sutton, now 79 years old, retired maritime attorney. Address in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, just outside Charleston. Phone number. 1 adult child. A son, from a previous marriage, estranged. No current spouse listed. Living alone. They also included a note. Subject has been listed as a registered user on Ancestry DNA since 2019. This is relevant to your inquiry. I sat with that information for a long time. There was a part of me, the part that had been operating on pure survival mode for 4 years, that wanted to protect whatever remained of the ground under my feet. I had already lost so much that the idea of reaching out to a stranger who happened to share half my DNA and then being rejected or ignored felt like a loss I couldn't absorb. I had a name and an address and a matched DNA profile sitting 1 click away, and I chose not to click. I told myself I would reach out when I felt steadier. I told myself it wasn't urgent. I was wrong about that. I was discharged from Erlanger with a medication protocol and a directive to follow up with a cardiologist in Knoxville within 2 weeks. Dr. Vasquez shook my hand at discharge and said, Mr. Whitmore, please make that call about your biological father, not for the inheritance or whatever family complications come with it, just for the medical picture. Your kids need that information. I nodded. I went home. I started the Knoxville follow-up process. I did not make the call to Harold Sutton. 3 months passed. Then 5. I was managing the arrhythmia, working again at something closer to my previous capacity, and I had successfully convinced myself that the Harold Sutton question was a side issue I would handle eventually. In March, I got a phone call from a woman who introduced herself as Paulette Greer, 39, an estate attorney with a firm in Charleston called Greer & Associates. She said she was calling on behalf of the estate of Harold Sutton. Mr. Sutton passed away 6 weeks ago, she said. He included a provision in his estate documents referencing a potential biological heir. He had registered with several DNA testing services, and his profile had flagged a significant match. We believe that match is you. I had to sit down. He knew? I said. He had known for approximately 3 years, Paulette said. He hired a private researcher in 2021 who traced the match through your Ancestry DNA profile and identified you. He made attempts to initiate contact that were redirected and went unanswered. She paused. Mr. Sutton was quite specific in his final instructions. He wanted his biological son contacted and given the opportunity to submit to a formal DNA verification, which would confirm eligibility for his estate. The estate has a verification window of 45 days from the date of this call. What does the estate consist of? There was a brief pause. The primary assets include a commercial real estate portfolio, a retirement account, and a residential property in the South of Broad neighborhood of Charleston. Total estimated value is approximately $2.4 million. I didn't say anything for a long time. Mr. Whitmore? He tried to contact me, I said. It wasn't a question. Yes, 3 times according to our records. Letters to your address in Knoxville, 2 of which appear to have been returned. 1 forwarded but apparently misrouted. I thought about the stack of mail I had stopped opening during the worst year of the divorce. I thought about the apartment I had moved into, and moved out of, and moved back into, and whether my mail forwarding had ever worked the way it was supposed to. I thought about Harold Sutton, a man I had never met who had known about me for 3 years, who had written me letters I never received, who had put a provision in his will just in case. He didn't know if I would ever show up, I said. No, Paulette said, but he made a place for you anyway. I submitted to the DNA verification at a certified lab in Knoxville 8 days later. The results came back in another 10. The match was confirmed. Harold Sutton was my biological father, and I was the sole heir named in his estate documents. I will not pretend that the size of the inheritance didn't matter. I am not built for that kind of dishonesty. $2.4 million, after 4 years of rebuilding from a gutted firm, and a gutted marriage, and a medical situation that had added new costs on top of everything, was the kind of number that makes the air feel different. But what sat underneath the relief, underneath and heavier than it, was something I hadn't expected. Harold Sutton had known about me. He had tried to find me. He had been turned away or simply unanswered, and he had not given up on the idea of me even when he had every reason to. He had put me in his will before he had ever heard my voice. I never got to tell him anything. I drove to Charleston in April to meet with Paulette and go through the estate process in person. Mount Pleasant is a coastal town with the kind of light that makes everything look either beautiful or sad, depending on what you're carrying when you arrive. I was carrying quite a bit. I spent 2 days working through paperwork, and 1 afternoon walking through Harold's house in the South of Broad neighborhood, a 3-story Charleston single house with a piazza running along the 2nd floor and hardwood floors that creaked in the same place every time you crossed the threshold of the front hallway. His housekeeper, a woman named Adele who was 67 and had worked for Harold for 19 years, met me at the door. She had clearly been crying, but she composed herself and showed me through the house with a kind of dignity that I found almost unbearable. In the study, she pointed to a framed photograph on the bookshelf. He put that there about 2 years ago, she said, after he got the DNA results. It was a photograph I recognized because it was my own. It was a photo from the firm's website, the professional headshot I had updated in 2020. Harold had printed it and framed it and put it on his bookshelf. I had to leave the room for a moment. Adele made us both coffee and we sat at the kitchen table, and she told me what she knew about Harold. He had practiced maritime law for 30 years, mostly in admiralty cases involving cargo disputes and insurance claims. Dense, technical work that he had apparently loved. He had been married once, in his 30s, briefly and unhappily. He had 1 son from that marriage, a man named Stewart, with whom he had been estranged for over a decade due to what Adele described only as a very bad business situation that neither of them could get past. He had a group of friends who played chess on Thursday evenings at a cafe on King Street. He had a dog, a beagle named Checkpoint, who had been placed with a neighbor after Harold's death. He was a quiet man, Adele said. Not unfriendly. Just private. He kept to himself, but the last few years he was different, more unsettled. He was looking for me, I said. She looked at me steadily. Yes, she said. I think that's right. I drove back to Knoxville with the estate paperwork in a folder on the passenger seat, and a feeling in my chest that was not the arrhythmia but something older and harder to treat. I had spent years being the person who got left, by Renata, by my own kids in their different ways, by the contracts that dried up and the engineers who moved on. And now I was discovering that someone had been looking for me the entire time, and I had been too buried in my own damage to look up. I didn't tell anyone about the inheritance for 6 weeks. Not my attorney, not my sister Karen, not Abby. I needed time to understand what it meant before other people started telling me what to do with it. Renata found out anyway. I don't know exactly how. My best guess is that Kieran mentioned something. Abby had let something slip to him during one of their calls, And Kieran, to his credit, had not meant to tell his mother. But Renata found out, and the first I knew of it was a phone call from her that came on a Tuesday evening while I was cooking dinner. "I heard you came into some money," she said. No preamble. "I don't really want to have this conversation right now," I said. "We need to talk about the kids' college funds. If you're in a position to contribute more significantly than you have been, the divorce agreement has a provision." "I know what the agreement says. I wrote a check every month for 4 years. I'm not attacking you. I'm just saying that if your financial situation has changed materially, there are things we should revisit." "Like what?" She paused. "My attorney thinks there may be grounds to revisit the settlement structure, given that significant undisclosed assets." "There were no undisclosed assets," I said. "The inheritance happened after the divorce was final. That's not how it works. My attorney disagrees." I ended the call. Then I dialed my own attorney, a woman named Linda Cho, who had handled my post-divorce modifications and who I trusted more than almost anyone in my life at that point. I told her what had happened and what Renata had said. Linda was quiet for a moment. "She has no case," she said. "Tennessee law is very clear. Post-divorce inheritances are separate property, full stop. If it wasn't a marital asset at the time of the decree, she has no claim. The fact that it came from a biological father you weren't even aware of during the marriage makes this even more straightforward." "Can she actually file something?" "She can file anything she wants. It won't go anywhere." It didn't go anywhere. Renata's attorney sent a letter, Linda responded, and that was essentially the end of it. But the attempt itself, the speed of it, the certainty that the first instinct when she heard the news was to find an angle, told me everything I needed to know about the years of the marriage I had apparently been misreading. Kieran called me 2 weeks after Renata's call. This was unusual. He typically waited for me to initiate, had been doing so since he was 17. When I saw his name on my phone, I felt the specific braced feeling that had become my default response to contact from my son. "Hey," he said. "Hey, good to hear from you." Silence. "Then Mom told me about the inheritance thing." "Yeah, is it? Is it a lot?" I thought about how to answer that honestly without making it worse. "It's significant," I said. "Yes." Another silence. "She's saying she's going to take you back to court." Her attorney looked at it. "It's not going to go anywhere." "Okay." Pause. "Dad, He stopped. Started again. "I've been thinking about calling you for a while. Before the money thing. I just want you to know that." "I believe you," I said. And I did. Mostly. "I've been talking to someone. A therapist. She's been helping me kind of sort through stuff about the divorce. About how I handled things with you." I sat down because I needed to. "How have you been handling things with me?" "Not great," he said. "I know that. I've known that for a while." We talked for 40 minutes. It was the longest conversation we had had in 3 years, and it was not easy and it was not resolved by the end of it. But it was honest in a way that our relationship had not been since he was maybe 14. He told me he had carried a lot of anger from the divorce that he had directed at me, without fully understanding why. I told him I hadn't handled the post-divorce years well, and that some of his anger had probably been warranted. We didn't fully agree on the proportions, but we talked about them. When we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time without moving. Abby called the following day. She said, "Dad, are you okay? I feel like everything just got weird and I don't know what's happening." "Everything is fine," I said. "Your mom was looking at some legal options and there aren't any. It's settled." "Is it a lot of money?" "It's enough, Dad, it's a lot," I said. "Yes." She was quiet then. "Who was he?" "The biological grandfather I never knew about." I told her about Harold. I told her about the maritime law career and the Thursday chess games, and the house in Charleston with the creaking floor, and the framed photograph he had put on his bookshelf. I told her about Adele making us coffee and pointing at my professional headshot. Abby was crying by the end of it. So was I, more or less. "He didn't even get to meet you," she said. "No, that's really sad, Dad." "Yeah," I said. "It is. There is a thing that happens sometimes when you have been in damage mode for so long that you stop being able to imagine anything different. You make peace with the reduced version of your life. You stop expecting better. You become a person who folds tables into permanence and Wednesday evenings into enough. I had done that. I had become very good at it. The money from Harold's estate did not fix the things that were broken. Kieran and I are still working on it. We are in a better place than we were 2 years ago, but the ground between us is still uneven in places and probably will be for a while. The firm is rebuilding in a way that feels more deliberate now, more considered. I hired an operations director, a woman named Priya Venkataraman, 44, who has the organizational intelligence I never had. and who has been quietly transforming the way we run the day-to-day in ways I am still discovering. We won a significant state infrastructure contract last fall. It was the first time in years I felt like something I built was stable again. I took Abby to Charleston in the fall. I showed her the house in south of Broad. Adele let us in and gave us a tour and told Abby stories about Harold, the chess games, the way he cataloged his bookshelves with a system only he fully understood, the time he had argued a case before a federal court in Norfolk and come home looking like he hadn't slept in 3 days but somehow satisfied. Abby listened with the kind of attention she gives things she wants to make sure she remembers. Before we left, Adele gave her a chess piece. A bishop from the set Harold had used every Thursday at the King Street Cafe. The cafe owner had given it to Adele after the memorial. He would have wanted her to have something, Adele said. Abby held it the whole drive home. I used a portion of Harold's estate to endow a research fellowship in cardiac hereditary conditions at the Medical University of South Carolina. It was the hospital system where Dr. Vasquez's referral network had originated, and the condition Harold had passed to me was exactly the kind of thing such research was designed to trace. I named the fellowship after him, Harold G. Sutton Fellowship in Hereditary Cardiac Medicine. Paulette helped me set it up. It felt like the only version of introduction I still had available to me. What I think about when I think about all of it is the 3 letters he sent that I never opened. One was returned to sender. One was forwarded to a wrong address. One is presumably somewhere in a pile I stopped going through in the worst year of the divorce. Already yellowed and waiting in whatever storage unit or landfill that particular chapter of my life ended up in. 3 times, a man I had never met had reached out into the world towards someone he only knew from a DNA percentage and a professional headshot. 3 times, the world had gotten in the way. He made a place for me anyway. That's the part I can't stop turning over. Not the money, not the house in Charleston, not the fellowship or the legal victory over Renata's failed claim. The part I'm coming back to is a quiet man in a house with creaking floors who put a stranger's photograph on his bookshelf and updated his will to say, if he ever shows up, let him in. I showed up too late to thank him. But I showed up, that has to count for something. I have decided that it does.